Welcome to another broadcast of Crime Beat with Ron Chepesiuk, the show that puts you, the listener, into the back alleys and boardrooms of the world's most fascinating subject, crime. Crime Beat brings you a lineup of dynamic and provocative guests who allow you to experience their lives and learn more about crime. Al Prophet, the noted crime documentarian, says, quote, Crime Beat is the best show of its kind for the thinking listener, both entertaining and educational. Let me introduce the host of Crime Beat. A native of Thunder Bay, Canada, Ron Chepesiuk is an award-winning author, documentary producer and director, publisher, and screenwriter. He's the author of more than 36 books and 4,000 published magazine, newspaper, and internet articles. Ron is a two-time Fulbright Scholar to Bangladesh and Indonesia, was a consultant to the History Channel's Gangland TV series, and has worked as an instructor in UCLA's Extension Journalism program. 4 of Ron's books and several of his screenplays have been optioned for movies. For more information, visit ronchepesiuk.com. Given his publications, extensive travels, and in-depth interviews, Ron Chepesiuk today is the leading expert on the fascinating world of crime. Here he is, your host, Mr. Ron Chepesiuk.
Thank you, Scott, for that nice introduction. Good evening, world, wherever you are tonight. Well, Scott, from Russia with love. From Russia with love. And I'm not talking about Putin's gift to America. I finally got my visa to Russia, and I'll be going to Russia next month. In fact, we're going to have a show from Russia. We're going inside Russia. Is that going to be great?
Yeah, that sounds great. What are you going for?
I optioned a book of a guy that has 22 felony charges against him for cyber hacking, and he's an ex-cop, and he got asylum in Russia. It's a wild story, and he was on our show.
I remember
that about John Dugan.
Yep, I remember.
And so I'm going to go see him, and he invited me, and I'm working on this television project with him, and so I'm going to go. And I've always wanted to go to Russia. It's on my bucket list. You get to a certain age, and your bucket list is going down, and this is one of the items I'm going to get rid of on that. So you'll be hearing more about that in the weeks ahead. The show will be the third week of September. But anyways, I'm so excited I just can't hide it. I'm talking about one of my favorite subjects tonight with a fantastic guest. We're going to be with Jeffrey Sussman, and he's a noted boxing historian, and we're discussing his book, Boxing and the Mob, The Notorious History of the Sweet Science. I confess, it's the book I always wanted to write. More than any other sports, boxing has a history of being easy to rig. There are only 2 athletes, and one or both of them may be induced to accept a bribe. If not the fighters, then the judges or referees might be swayed. We'll talk a little bit about that later. In such inviting circumstances, the mob moved into boxing in the 1930s and profited by corrupting our sport ready for exploitation. And we still see the sweet science being exploited today. It's a fascinating subject, and it's going to be a fascinating show and discussion. And we're going to, first of all, take care of some business. Our acknowledgments to the people who are helping to make Crime Beat one of the most popular shows on the Internet. First, I'd like to thank all the listeners out there from around the world for tuning in to Crime Beat. We're thrilled and delighted to announce we're having overwhelming positive comments and thumbs up about our program. Some of our shows are now averaging between 150,000 and 200,000 listeners every week from more than 160 countries around the globe. Wolf Blitzer, eat your heart out. All shows are free and downloadable. You miss a live show, go to the artistfirst.com website to listen to it. You can take our shows and post them on the web on any website. You can even take the show. If you do sell them, remember this. This is a crime show. I have connections, so please send us a check. I'd like to thank our sponsor, TG Media Books, for supporting our show. I'd also like to thank Scott and all the production people of the Artist First Radio Network for making this show possible. And a special thanks to the Rock and Ryan brothers for allowing us to use their great music for our theme song. It's got the beat, the crime written all over it. Now let's look at the mailbag this week. We continue to get mail from all over the world. Some comments are long, so we edit them for length. This is from Myra of Long Island, New York. Myra writes, as a victim who was bullied in high school because of my speech impediment, I appreciate your show on bullying and bringing the problem to the public attention. I missed the original show, so thanks for running it again. We're talking about the command appearance last week, and we were talking with J.A. Yates, author of Bully to Death, The Story of Bullying, Social Media, and the Suicide of Cherokee Harriman. And joining her was Nancy Willard, who is an expert on cyberbullying. It was a great discussion on bullying and the problem that still plagues our society. So if you want to go just to listen to the show, you missed it, just go to our website at theartistfirst.com website. So what have you been up to? Go to tgmediabooks.com, and we have several books coming out on true crime. We have a book called Fake, about the news today, by John Didakis, and John was on the show a couple weeks ago to discuss the book, so you could check it out. And it's becoming rapidly a bestseller. Personally, a couple of my movies I have in the works are moving along at Hollywood pace, which means a snail pace. But we're making some progress, and I'll report more progress when it happens on that. Anyways, we offer affordable advertising opportunities for sponsors and authors. We have several packages to meet your budget. Contact us at crimebeat123@yahoo.com. Now let's take a look at next week's show on September 5th, 2019. The hits just hit coming. We're going to have a two-part program. The first part, next week, we'll have a panel discussion with three DA agents, Lou Diaz, Chuck Lutz, and Lou Rice. And we're going to talk about the legendary drug kingpins of the late 1970s, early 1970s, and late 1970s, Ike Atkinson, Frank Lucas, and Nicky Barnes. And we'll be discussing their legacy, and we're looking at it from a DA perspective. And the second part will follow the next week. We'll look at the street perspective, and we'll have three gentlemen that are from New York, and we'll talk about the impact of those drug traffickers on New York City, the black community, and the United States. Now, it's the news for this week. We call this a rap sheet part of our program. Our rap sheet features a couple items in the news that caught our attention and you might have missed. Since we have the show, it's focusing on boxing, we're going to have two boxing items here. The first comes from Baltimore. We have Mayor Jack Young, and he has a suggestion how a city could help end street beefs and disputes. A public boxing ring, that's what he suggests. Let them duke it out rather than try to shoot each other. It's a bold idea, it seems, that has received mixed reviews in the community, believe it or not. But hey, let's give Mayor Young credit for trying to quell the nonstop shootings on the streets of Baltimore, where gun violence among young African-American men have become a troublesome and dangerous way of life. Baltimore is now one of the nation's most violent cities, where guns are an integral part of inner city life. Baltimore has surpassed 300 homicides for 4 straight years. Over 120 people have been killed. This kind of rampant violence can't continue. Baltimore is losing a generation of young black men every day. Mayor Young said at the rally against gun violence, quote, if they want to really settle their disputes, we can have them down at the Civic Center. Put a boxing ring up and let them go and box it out. Wow, that's interesting. But, you know, to me it's nothing new. That's the way we used to settle our disputes, right, Scott?
Yeah, but I think he's on to something. You know how they got those paintball things? You can go into those warehouses and have a paintball match?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Let them shoot each other with real guns.
Let them shoot each other with real guns. You're talking like a science fiction. It's like it's something out of a science fiction movie.
New reality TV show. It'll make millions.
Yeah, man, you're bloodthirsty, man. We'll excuse it tonight. Anyways, this second item here, we have a dude named Gafur Rakhimov, and he's a businessman with alleged crimes to organized crime. It only so happens that he had to resign as president of the International Boxing Association after his tenure played a role in the body being stripped of the right to organize the Olympic boxing events. The Uzbekistani became interim president of the AIBA in January 2018 and was officially elected president 10 months later. That was despite opposition from the International Olympic Committee, which pointed to the United States sanctions against Rakhimov. The United States Treasury has accused him of involvement in drug production and heroin trafficking. Rakhimov denies any wrongdoing and is trying to have his sanctions listed. Last month, the AIBA's board removed a bylaw which could have allowed Rakhimov to lift his self-suspension and take back control of the organization. Talk about corrupt. We're going to be talking about the history of corruption, but it seems like it's still going on. This is a sign that it is. That's it for the rap sheet part of the program. We'll be back after a short station identification break with Jeffrey Sussman to discuss his great book. Scott?
You are listening to Crime Beat on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are available in podcast form. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Now back to your host, Mr. Ron Chepesiuk.
Thank you, Scott. Well, listeners, this week we have our special guest, Jeffrey Sussman, and we'll be discussing his book, Boxing and the Mob, The Notorious History of the Swiss Science. In Boxing and the Mob, Jeffrey Sussman tells the story of the coercive and criminal underside of boxing, covering near the entire 20th century. And is the mafia still involved in corrupt boxing? How can we be sure today that the fights we watch on TV and in person are not rigged? We'll find out tonight at the answers to those questions. Welcome to the show, Jeffrey Sussman.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Great. What do you think of the Mayor Young's idea in Baltimore of having him duke it out? I think that's a pretty good idea, don't you?
Well, it was interesting because when I was a teenager, I went to a summer camp, and if there was an altercation or an argument, the head of the camp would suggest that two boys get into the boxing ring and have a 3-round bout and settle it that way. Wow,
yeah, that's a lot better than drive-by shooting, right?
Much better.
Much better on that. But I can understand why it's so controversial. The article wrote, like, God, this is such a way out idea, to have this type of setup, to solve disputes. So that's what I found interesting about the article. Like, it was even considered controversial on that.
But anyway, at least the boxers aren't going to get killed with bullets at the end.
Exactly on that. But anyways, welcome to the show, and you've got a really interesting book. How is it doing?
It's doing very, very well. I'm pleased that it's doing so well. I've been giving a lot of talks at libraries and bookstores and clubs, and doing a number of radio interviews like yours and podcasts. So I've been very happy with it.
Yeah, is the people that show up? Are they boxing fans, or are they just curious about the mob? I mean,
I'm getting a combination of fans. I'm getting a combination of boxing fans, and I'm getting a combination of people who are interested in the mob.
Right, because I have a lot of people on my Facebook page, and I got some response about that. They said they want to listen to the show because they're interested in the mob. I said, "Aren't you interested in boxing?" And they say, "Yeah, boxing. We want to see what the mob did with the sport on that sort of thing." But I'm sort of jealous because you wrote the book I always wanted to write. But I was always told, and I had a feeling myself, that boxing books don't sell that well. So what's your secret to success?
Well, boxing certainly isn't as popular as it used to be many years ago, and the people who buy boxing books buy them for reasons other than just their interest in boxing. So, for example, the first boxing book I did was called Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing. And that sparked a lot of interest because people didn't know that there were Jewish boxers. And then the second book was about Rocky Graziano. And he was just such a colorful character that even if you weren't interested in boxing, his life story was fascinating.
Somebody up there loves you, right?
Somebody up there likes me.
Yeah, on that, right up there. That really great movie from the 50s, I guess.
Yeah, 1956, starring Paul Newman.
Yeah, on that.
It was the beginning of Newman's career.
Yeah, so that's good. That's good. That's good to know. And the book took you how long to do? Because you are a very successful public relations guy. I was really impressed with your website. And
thank you very much.
Yeah, and so how do you do this? Well, on your website it says 9 books, but I read somewhere else that there's 13 books.
Yeah, there are 13. So I have to update the website. I spent 6 months researching the book, and then I spent another 6 months writing the book. And I would I was very disciplined, so I would devote a certain number of hours each day to the book, and then a certain number of hours each day to my public relations and marketing business.
Right. It also helps that you're the boss, right?
It certainly does. You can make your own hours that way.
You can make your own hours, and no one's going to get on you for that. But one of the interesting things about you, and you mentioned this in your introduction, is that we all think that everything's out there on cyberspace today, but you use the old-fashioned public library, right? And being a former academic librarian myself, I thought that was really great. And you were very nice and kind to recognize, the contribution the library made to your book.
Yeah, there was a reference librarian named Stephen Spataro at the East Hampton Library who was able to get me old magazine articles, old newspaper articles, and was able to order books from other libraries that I needed to do my research. So I was very grateful to him.
Right. What advice would you give to other people, like listeners that want to write, but they have really tough jobs? They're working 8, 10, maybe 12 hours a day.
Well, there's always the weekend, and then I know people who get up very early in the morning. They get up maybe an extra 2 hours earlier, and they spend that time writing.
Right. Was it challenging to research this book? Is there a lot of information out there? I know you had the help of the librarian.
There was a lot of information out there, and it wasn't difficult for me because of the help I received from the librarian in getting the research that I needed.
Right. Well, you deal with a very fascinating part of boxing history. Is there any way of identifying the first act of corruption in modern boxing?
Well, what I did in the book is I tried to do this chronologically, starting with Arnold Rothstein, who was really the father of organized crime in America, and he was the man who fixed the 1919 World Series, the famous Black Sox scandal, and after that was over, and his bagman was a former featherweight boxing champion named David Tell, and the two of them realized after the Black Sox scandal that it would be a lot easier to fix a boxing match than it was to fix a baseball team, because there were so fewer players that you need to fix. Basically, if you could just get one boxer to take a dive, then you know what the outcome is going to be. And then for insurance, you can always bribe one of the judges or the referee. And that's what they did. And then they would bet on a sure thing. They knew what the outcome would be, and they would bet a lot of money, and they would spread it around amongst a lot of bookies so that no one would know that they were betting so much money on one particular fight, which would affect the odds. And they cleaned up. They made millions of dollars.
Right. Well, they weren't much of a gamblers because they didn't bet on anything they didn't know the outcome of, right?
Well, that was what Arnold Rothstein said. Arnold Rothstein said he would only bet on a sure thing. Right. And what was interesting is the famous gangster Meyer Lansky distinguished between gamblers and bettors. He said bettors are people who bet without knowing the outcome, and gamblers only get involved when they know what the outcome is going to be.
Right. Well, this Abe Attell is a really interesting guy. He was a world featherweight boxing champ from 1906 to 1912, and in the age when there was only one title, and I looked, and he's not in the Boxing Hall of Fame. Is that because of all the corruption that he seemingly was involved? He was found innocent, right, in the Black Sox scandal.
Well, it was funny because when he was dragged into court for the Black Sox scandal, he convinced the jury that he was the wrong Abe Attell, that there was another man named Abe Attell who was guilty, and they dismissed him. He just walked out of the court a free man.
Right, on that then. Did they fix any really significant fights?
Not really. The significant fights started being fixed a lot more in the 1930s. But there was some dispute about some of the Jack Dempsey fights, whether they were fixed. The Jack Dempsey Gene Tunney fight and a few of the others, because a lot of the fighters had backers who were mobsters, and if a mobster was backing a fighter, he wanted to make sure that his fighter won. And they would resort to all different kinds of tricks to make sure that happened.
And of course, in those days, there were no rules, right? I mean, there was no organization overseeing, making sure that people weren't doing bad things in boxing.
Well, it was interesting to see for instance, the Tunney Dempsey fight, because in the one that Dempsey lost, the referee didn't start counting until Dempsey would go to a neutral corner, and so there was what was called the long count. However, when Dempsey went down from a punch by Tunney, the referee started counting immediately, even though Tunney hadn't gone to a neutral corner, which made people think that the referee had been paid off to make sure that Tunney won the fight.
Right. Was there any investigation of that?
There was a lot of noise about it, but it really wasn't much of an investigation.
Right. Well, we move on to the 1930s, and we have a real nasty gangster guy named Oni Madden, right?
He was known as only the Killer Madden because he had killed a lot of people, and he was head of a New York gang called the Gophers, and
right.
And he made a fortune during Prohibition, and when Prohibition ended, he was looking for another way to make a lot of money, and he realized that fixed championship boxing matches was the way to go, and he bought the contract of an Italian boxer named Primo Carnera, who had been a circus strongman. He wasn't even really a boxer, and they kind of trained him, and they fixed all of his fights right up to getting him the World Heavyweight Championship. It was fascinating. There were two movies based on his career that were made in the 1950s that are terrific movies. One is called Requiem for a Heavyweight, and the other one is called The Harder They Fall.
Right. That was the first one was Anthony Quinn, right?
Anthony Quinn was in one, and Humphrey Bogart was in the other one.
Yeah. I just saw it about a month ago again, and it still holds up. It's an amazing, sad but amazing movie on that.
Yeah. The Anthony Quinn character was a very sad character.
Right. But that's one of the most enjoyable parts of the book. I was just fascinated because I knew something about Primo Carnera, but you really added a lot to his story. And he had a contract with a guy named Leon C.
Right.
So how did Oni get control of Primo?
Well, basically he threatened C. I mean, C had to go back to France, and this is the way Oni operated. You either went along with him or you ran the risk of being killed. That's the ultimate weapon that mobsters have. They can be nice and they can be charming and they can offer you this and that, but if you don't accept it, they'll kill you.
Right. But what's really interesting is that Primo was feather-fisted, but he was 6'7". He would be big by today's standards, right? Yeah,
he was one of the biggest heavyweight boxers there's ever been.
Well, how do you explain that? I mean, it's amazing. He couldn't knock out a bird with a punch.
I know he had these kind of powder puff punches, and yet his managers led him to believe that he was really a very good boxer, and that he was winning his fights legitimately, and he was a good-natured, naive kind of guy who believed what they were telling him.
Right. But there was a boxer that actually died in the ring with him, a guy named Ernie Schaff, right? He was fighting Primo. So what's the truth on that? Why did he die?
Well, he had a fight with Max Baer. I think it was 2 months before his fight with Primo Carnera, and Max Baer, according to Jack Dempsey, was the hardest-hitting heavyweight fighter he had ever seen. And Max Baer had previously killed a fighter in the ring, a man named Frankie Campbell, and after Ernie Schaff's fight with Max Baer, Ernie Schaff complained that he had terrible headaches and he wasn't feeling well and so forth.
Right.
And he just kind of got this powder punch right cross from Primo Carnera, and that's all it took to cause the hemorrhage to start in his brain, and that's what killed him.
Right. Well, that's one of the most interesting parts of the book too, because I saw the movie Cinderella Man, and Max Baer played a part, but he was completely different in the movie than in your book, right? So what's the story of who was Max Baer?
Max Baer in the 1930s was as popular as Muhammad Ali was in his day. He was very handsome. He was clever. He was witty. He used to date showgirls and movie stars, and his name was always in the gossip columns and in the entertainment sections of newspapers. Mm-hmm. He really preferred entertaining rather than boxing, and he did the boxing really just for the money. But he took the championship away from Primo Carnera, and two of Oni Madden's henchmen went to Max Baer and Max Baer's manager, a man named Ansel Hoffman, just prior to the fight, and wanted Max Baer to throw the fight. And Ansel Hoffman told them, "Forget it, we're not doing it." And for some reason, Oni Madden's henchmen didn't do anything. And probably because there were a lot of investigations in the mid-1930s into the mob, and Oni Madden didn't want any more heat brought onto him. So he said to hell with it, and Max Spear beat him and won the heavyweight championship.
Wow.
But in the process, he must have knocked Primo Carnera down 10 or 11 times during the fight, and he broke his jaw, and he broke 3 ribs, and he broke a bone in his arm. Wow. And the mob completely deserted Primo. They wouldn't pay any of his medical bills. So Max Spear stepped in and paid all of Primo Carnera's medical bills. And when Primo Carnera left boxing, Max Spear got him a job as a professional wrestler. And from professional wrestling, Primo Carnera was able to earn back all the money that the mob stole from him.
Wow.
And when Max Spear died, I think it was in 1950, Primo Carnera was in Italy, and he couldn't get back in time for the funeral. He got to California a week later and had his driver take him to the cemetery where Max Spear was buried. And it was late at night, and the cemetery was closed. So Primo Carnera and his driver climbed over the fence. They located Max Spear's tombstone, and there Primo Carnera knelt down, said a prayer, crossed himself, and said to his driver, Max Spear was the best friend I ever had.
Wow, that's really touching. We should mention the connection of the Beverly Hillbillies, the old show from the 60s.
Right, because Max Spear's son, Max Spear Jr., played the part of Jethro in the Beverly Hillbillies. Right. And I did some interviews with Max Spear Jr. and he was delightful to talk to. He told me a very cute story that when he was in college, he thought he might like to become a boxer, and his father said, "No, I don't want you to do this. This is not for you. It's a very rough life," and so forth. And Max Spear Jr. said, "Well, could you at least teach me how to box?" And Max Spear Sr. said, "Yes, we'll go into the backyard. We'll put on big puffy gloves so we don't hurt each other, and I'll teach you the elements of boxing. I'll teach you how to jab, how to throw an uppercut, how to throw a right cross, etc." And so they started doing that, and Max Spear Jr. got carried away, and all of a sudden he punched his father in the face, and he saw that his father's eyes completely changed, and the next thing he knew, he was lying on his back looking up at the sky, and his mother was hanging out of a second-story bedroom window, and she was yelling at her husband saying, "You killed him! You killed him! Why did you kill our son?"
That's funny. Well, you mentioned what Jack Dempsey said about him being a hardest puncher. How would you compare to, say, Deontay Wilder today, or even Ernie Shavers back in the 70s? I mean, was he on that level as a puncher?
Oh yeah, he was really the hardest puncher probably around. You know, he lost a fight to Joe Louis, and he lost the fight to Joe Louis because he had 2 broken hands, and a doctor injected his fists with Novocaine so that he could fight. However, the fight was held outdoors at Yankee Stadium, and it was raining, and by the time the rain stopped at 11 o'clock at night for the fight to commence, the Novocaine had worn off in Max Spear's fists, and he went out and he fought Joe Louis, but he couldn't defend himself. 6 months later, his fists had healed, and he wanted a rematch with Joe Louis, and Joe Louis's manager would not give him a rematch because he was so nervous that Max Spear would knock out Joe Louis with 1 punch. He didn't want to take a chance.
Right, so they never fought him there. The interesting thing about Primo Carnera is he never talked about Oni Madden, right? Well, why was that? Was he embarrassed, or was he afraid?
I think he was very embarrassed about what happened to him. He had a son and a daughter who I think were embarrassed that their father had been taken advantage of, and the world kind of knew it. And I just think he wanted to forget it and go on with his life.
Right. Well, one of the interesting chapters has one of the best titles, The Machiavelli of Promoters, and we're talking about Mike Jacobs. In what way was he Machiavelli?
Well, he was the man who owned Joe Louis's contract, and he was a very kind of shady character, and he he would get 10% of Joe Louis's purses as long as Joe Louis remained the heavyweight champion. So he always made sure that Joe Louis had an opponent who Joe Louis could beat so that he could collect his 10%.
Right.
And he manipulated fighters. He took advantage of them. He was not a nice person. He wasn't a mobster, but he came very, very close to being one.
Jeffrey, I got news for you. None of these guys are nice people.
That's true. None of them are nice.
None of them are very nice. So, I mean...
well, it's funny because one of Mike Jacobs' relatives came to one of my book talks, and she came up to me afterwards and she said, Mike was a real son of a bitch. Nobody in the family liked him at all.
That's verification of that. But does this diminish, because not many people know this about Joe Louis, and he's considered one of the great heavyweights of all time, if not the greatest. Does that diminish his reputation as a great?
No, he was genuinely a great fighter. There's no question about it. I mean, he beat some very substantial boxers, some really good boxers, and he did it without having to have any fights fixed. It was just that Mike Jacobs was very careful in choosing opponents for him, especially as Joe Louis got older and may have become more vulnerable to younger opponents.
And he was maybe lucky too. He was fighting in an era when there weren't that many great opponents. Was there?
No, there wasn't. As a matter of fact, my father, growing up, had a very close friend who became a heavyweight boxer named Abe Simon and fought Joe Louis twice in 1941 and 1942. He lost both times. In the first fight, he lasted 12 rounds, and in the second fight, Joe Louis knocked him out in the 6th round. And then Abe Simon went on to play mobsters in movies, and his best role was in the movie On the Waterfront.
Yeah, exactly. He's a scary-looking guy.
Yeah, he was very scary. He was about 6'4", weighed about 260 pounds, and had a rectangular face that reminded me of Frankenstein.
He does look like Frankenstein.
Right, but when I was a boy, I met him, and he was just the sweetest, gentlest old guy you could imagine. It was hard to imagine him as this tough heavyweight fighter.
Okay. Well, we're going to stop right there. We're going to move into the mob and how the mob moves into boxing. And first, we're going to take a break.
Okay.
Then we'll come back and to tell our listeners how people can buy your book. Scott, let's take a break, run some commercials. We'll be back shortly.
Hey everybody, Z-Man here to tell you about another great book from Strategic Media Books. Longtime CNN journalist John Didakis is back with his third mystery novel, a gripping thriller titled Troubled Water. The book features the young feisty reporter Lark Chadwick. Just as Lark is about to begin her new job on the cops and courts beat, she discovers the body of a strangled girl, the first victim of a serial killer. Lark has to deal with rivals in the newsroom, a superstar athlete with anger issues, a hunky colleague who becomes a suspect, and her job's in danger. With the help of her friend Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Lionel Stone, Lark is tested like never before in a dramatic life-and-death showdown with the killer. Troubled Water by author John Didakis shows what happens when you pair a cub reporter with murder, mayhem, and a handsome bad boy. You get a great book. Pick up your copy at strategicmediabooks.com. That's strategicmediabooks.com.
Hi, I'm James Baller of Artist First Radio, and I would like to tell you about a fascinating new book from Crime Beat's Ron Chepesiuk and co-author Mike Rowe. It's titled Robin Hood of the Hood, The Life and Times of Teddy Rowe, Policy Kingpin, and it's published by Strategic Media Books. The book is a historical account of Theodore Teddy Rowe, who courageously fought the Chicago Mafia, more commonly known as the Outfit, for control of the lucrative policy racket in the Windy City. Policy, often called the numbers, is a form of illegal gambling or illegal lottery, played mostly in poor and working-class neighborhoods in the United States. In Policy, a bettor attempts to pick 3 digits to match those that will be randomly drawn the following day. For decades, Policy had been a staple in the black community, but when the white mob flexed its power in the late 1940s, many Policy kings knuckled under the pressure. Not Teddy Rowe. Rowe famously told mob bosses that he'd rather die than give up control of his operation. Robin Hood of the Hood chronicles an exciting chapter of Chicago history. Go to the Kindle store at Amazon and buy it for just $2.99. For information about this book and other titles, please go to strategicmediabooks.com. That's strategicmediabooks.com.
You are listening to Crime Beat on the Artist First Radio Network. Send us your questions and comments. Hit us up at crimebeat123@yahoo.com. Now back to your host, Mr. Ron Chepesiuk.
Thank you, Scott. We're here with Jeffrey Sussman, and he's the author of Boxing and the Mob, The Notorious History of the Sweet Science. And you can see that the history is just really fascinating. And the book is available everywhere, Jeffrey?
Yes, it's especially available at Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com and various other online booksellers.
Right, and of course there's an ebook.
There's an ebook, and there's also a company called Tantor Media has an audio version of the book.
Right, I think audio version would be good for our listeners listening to you because you got some really great stories, and the book is very narrative. So I think that would be a good purchase as well. And you're active on Facebook.
Yes.
And people could connect to you on that, and Twitter.
I don't do Twitter as much, but I'm very active on Facebook.
Right. Can they? You've got a website, company website, powerpublicity.com.
Right, and my email address is on that website as well.
Right, and you don't mind people emailing you asking questions about boxing?
No, that's fine. I'm very happy to answer people's questions.
Right. Are you on YouTube?
Yes, yeah. There are a number of interviews I've done about this book and other boxing books, all on YouTube. Right.
Okay. On that, so we'll get back to our fascinating discussion here. We're going to move into the mob, the La Cosa Nostra. How did they become involved with boxing, and when did this happen?
Well, as we said, first there was Oni Madden, and Oni Madden retired from boxing in the late 1930s, and he moved to Hot Springs, Arkansas,
right.
and made Hot Springs sort of a resort town for mobsters who were on the lam, or mobsters who wanted to get away from their criminal activity for a while, who needed some rest and relaxation. And for instance, when Lucky Luciano was indicted and Thomas Dewey was looking for him, Lucky Luciano stayed in Hot Springs, Arkansas as a guest of Oni Madden for 12 months until he was finally extradited back to New York. And what was interesting, Oni Madden, in the last few years of his life, became very ill and needed round-the-clock nursing care, and his nurse was Bill Clinton's mother.
Oh wow! I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Yeah. A lot of people didn't know that.
Yeah. Wow.
And then when Oni left New York, there was a void, and Mike Jacobs came in and filled that void.
Right.
And then Mike Jacobs had a couple of strokes, and that left an opportunity for Frankie Carbo, who had been a member of Murder Incorporated and had killed 19 people as a member of Murder Incorporated. And the head of the Philadelphia Mafia at one time, a man named Ralph Natali, said that Frankie Carbo was also the gunman who killed Bugsy Siegel in Los Angeles in 1947. And yet Bugsy Siegel and Frankie Carbo had been partners in Murder Incorporated.
Yeah.
So never trust your partner.
And Carbo had a frontman, a guy named Blinky Palermo, another nasty individual. He was the numbers king of Philadelphia, right?
Exactly. Yeah, Blinky Palermo was the numbers king of Philadelphia, and then they teamed up with a man named Norris. Last name was Norris, who
James Norris?
Excuse me?
Is that James Norris?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who was came from a very wealthy Chicago family. At one time, they even owned the Chicago Merchandise Mart, and they owned a lot of sports teams. But he liked hanging around with mobsters, and he liked boxers, and he got control of Madison Square Garden when Frankie Carbo came on the scene, and then they partnered with another man named Truman Gibson, who came from an entirely different background. He was the man who helped Harry Truman integrate the United States Army after World War II, and he was a highly respected black civil rights lawyer. He was also Joe Lewis's lawyer, and he didn't do a good job for Joe Lewis. He was one of the people who engineered that contract with Mike Jacobs that was to Joe Lewis's disadvantage, and then later on he didn't do such great things for Joe Lewis. But these four men were able to control much of the middleweight and welterweight divisions all across the country, especially in New York at Madison Square Garden at that time. If a middleweight or a welterweight wanted to have a fight in Madison Square Garden, they had to get the okay from Carbo and Palermo. And in order to get the okay, you had to either pay them a lot of money, or you had to sign over your contract to them, or sign over a large portion of your contract. And they also were making a ton of money from what was in the 1950s, the Friday night fights and the Wednesday night fights, which were televised. And when a trainer named Ray Arcel started the Saturday night fights from
Robert Duran's trainer.
Roberto Duran's trainer, right. They threatened him that he couldn't televise fights, and he ignored them. So Frankie Carbo sent a thug up to Boston who came up behind Ray Arcel one night and hit him over the head with a lead pipe wrapped in newspaper and fractured Ray Arcel's skull. And he was in the hospital for about 4 weeks. And when he regained consciousness, they told him that if he ever got involved in boxing again, they would kill him. And so he stayed out of boxing, I think it was 14 or 17 years, until Roberto Duran's manager went to him and said, Roberto needs someone who can really train him to be a champ. And Ray Arcel was able to okay it with the mob on condition that he didn't take any money for his work. And so he completely trained Roberto Duran without ever getting paid for it.
Wow, yeah, and of course Roberto Duran went on to become one of the greatest fighters of all time.
Sure.
And Arcel lived to a very old age too, which was interesting, given that he was brained by the. Did they? How many fights did they fix? I mean, I remember
hundreds of fights.
Hundreds of fights. Give us some examples of some of the famous fights that. Well, for example, the Raging Bull, Jack LaMotta.
Yeah. Jake LaMotta had been declared the unofficial middleweight champion of the world. He was beating everyone who he got in the ring with, but they would not give him a shot at the middleweight title. And Frankie Carbo came to him and he said, if you want a shot at the middleweight title, you have to take a dive in a fight that will let you know which fight it is. And it was Jake didn't want to do it. But eventually he realized that the only way he's going to get a shot at the title is if he goes along with this. So he finally relented, and they gave him $100,000 to lose against Billy Fox. And Jake LaMotta, not being an idiot, bet the $100,000 on Billy Fox because he knew he would win. But it was so obvious to fans in the ring that Jake wasn't putting up much of a defense, that people in the audience were yelling, "Fix, fake, etc." And then Jake had six more fights after that, and he finally got a shot at the middleweight title, where he beat the French middleweight champion, a man named Marcel Cerdan, and that's how Jake LaMotta finally got to be the middleweight champion. But he really had to do something that he didn't want to do, and and that happened to a lot of them. Now, Carmen Basilio, who was also a champion, his manager wanted him to have a championship bout, and Carbo told him, "Well, you're going to have to pay us if you want that." And Carmen Basilio said, "I'm not paying. I work hard for the money that I get. I get my face battered in." And he said to his manager, "If you want to pay them some money, you can pay it out of your percentage, but I'm not giving them anything." And that's what happened. And that's how Carmen Basilio got his shot at the title. The one person who successfully stood up against Frankie Carbo, and it was because he was such a good fighter and so popular at the time, was Sugar Ray Robinson. Frankie Carbo was constantly trying to get Sugar Ray to come in with him, to throw a fight, to do this, to do that, and Sugar Ray refused to do anything at all with Frankie Carbo, and he got away with it.
Yeah, well, Sugar Ray Robinson is considered pound for pound the greatest fighter of all time, and also pound for pound, he's got maybe the best character of all time as well, being able to fend off the mob,
Yeah, I mean, he was a very smart guy. He was also his own manager, so he negotiated his own boxing contracts, and he was one of the toughest negotiators in boxing.
Right. Well, we're going to take another break. We'll come back, talk about Sonny Liston, and then talk about Sammy Gravano and what his eye-opening testimony. Scott, let's take another break, and we'll be back to the last segment of our show tonight.
Hey everyone, there's a new book out by author Barbara Casey, Flower. It's book 3 in the FIG mystery series. FIG stands for Females of Intellectual Genius, and there's 3, and they're all orphans. Dara Rowe, abandoned when she was 7 years old by her mother, exceptionally gifted in foreign languages, accepted to Yale University. Mackenzie Yarborough, no record of her parents or where she was born, exceptionally gifted in math and problem solving, accepted to MIT. Jennifer Torres, both parents killed in a car accident, exceptionally gifted in music and art, accepted to Juilliard. The girls are friends and graduates of Woodrose Orphanage and Academy for Young Women. After graduation, they end up separated pursuing their life's goals, when Mackenzie suddenly faces a terrifying death from the blood-dripping teeth of an ancient evil dragon in, of all places, China. The 3 females of intellectual genius will need all their special talents to keep Mackenzie alive. The Clock Flower, the latest young adult novel in the award-winning FIG mystery series by Barbara Casey, available through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and booksellers everywhere. You are listening to Crime Beat on the Artist First Radio Network. Back to your host, Mr. Ron Chepesiuk.
Thank you, Scott. We're here with Jeffrey Sussman. He's the author of Boxing and the Mob, The Notorious History of the Sweet Science, and we're discussing some really interesting characters and some developments in the history of boxing. The book is available everywhere. There's an audiobook, ebook. You can check out Jeffrey on Facebook. He doesn't Twitter too much, but you can also go to YouTube where you can see him in action. And he's got a website, Power Publicity, which talks about his company mostly, but it's an interesting website anyways. So anything you wish to add to that, Jeffrey?
No, that was fine. That was very good. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. And so we're getting back to the discussion. Let's talk about the sad case of Sonny Liston, and the guy that was controlled by the mob. And of course, they said that he died of an overdose in Las Vegas, and that was always controversial. But you seem to think that he was murdered by the mob.
Yeah, I'm not the only one who thinks that. There are a lot of people who think that he was murdered by the mob. You know, Sonny Liston had been frightened of needles his whole life, and yet they found a needle in his arm, and claimed that he died of a self-inflicted drug overdose. What I think it was the medical examiner in Las Vegas speculated that Sonny had been drugged by some friends who may have put something in one of his drinks that knocked him out. And when he had been knocked out, that's when they injected him what's called a hot shot of heroin, which killed him.
Right.
And
you go ahead.
There were a couple of theories about why the mob wanted him dead. One was that he was getting involved in the heroin trade in Las Vegas, and he was impinging on the territory of the mobsters who ran that in Vegas, and they wanted him out of the way. And the other theory was that he had threatened to go to the Justice Department and tell them about how the mob had fixed his last fight with Muhammad Ali, and that the mob had made millions, and Sonny was angry because he hadn't gotten what they were supposed to pay him, and so he was going to reveal what the mob was doing, and they didn't want that because it was during the 60s when the federal government was really going after the mob in a big way.
Robert Kennedy, right? I remember, I was a very young kid, and I watched both those fights, and of course there was that phantom punch in the second fight, right?
Right.
And no one gave. I remember being at school, and everybody was laughing that Ali was fighting Liston, and so it was a major upset. Was any doubt that those two fights were on the level?
The first fight, Sonny Liston couldn't come out in the seventh round. He said he couldn't move one arm, and everyone thought that he just gave up because the fight was fixed. But they actually x-rayed his arm 3 days later, and apparently he had bled from his shoulder into his bicep, and that's why he couldn't move the arm. But in the second fight, there seems little doubt that was a fixed fight. The FBI thought it was fixed, and their conclusions about it are online if anyone wants to read it. Also, Sonny Liston's wife, Geraldine, told people after the fight that she told Sonny to lay down in the first round since the fight is fixed anyway. Why fight longer than the first round and get hurt if the fight is fixed? Just get your money after the first round and be finished with it. And there was a gangster in St. Louis named John Vitale who owned a percentage of Sonny Liston's contract, and a capo in his Borgata wanted to go up to Lewiston, Maine, to see the fight, and John Vitale told him, "Don't bother going; it'll be over before you get there." And then a gambler in Las Vegas named Ash Resnick, who also owned a piece of Sonny Liston, he had a friend who said to him that he also wanted to go up to Lewiston to see the fight, and Ash Resnick said to him, "It'll be over before you get into your seat." So obviously the mob knew about it, and there was a lot of money bet on Muhammad Ali to win, and the mob cleaned up. Supposedly Ash Resnick won over $1 million on that fight.
Was there any approach by the mob to Ali?
No, Ali had. I don't think he had any knowledge whatsoever that Sonny Liston had been fixed. He didn't have to know, and also the black Muslims who were around Ali probably would not have permitted that to happen.
Right, on that. Well, of course, we have the great undefeated champion, Rocky Marciano, and he's Italian. What's the story of him and the corruption in boxing?
Well, his manager was really very corrupt, and Marciano, after he retired from boxing, there are stories. Now, I'm not saying they're all true, but there are stories that he became a collector for the mob, for people who owed mob money. But he had 49 fights. He was undefeated, but most of the people he fought who had been champions at one time were way past their prime. And it was easy for him to defeat them. Easy for him to defeat a balding old Joe Louis, an old Archie Moore. I mean, these guys were way past their prime. Yeah. And it seemed as if the mob really arranged to him to have opponents who were easy for him to knock over.
Right. So we're getting near the end of our discussion, unfortunately, but so
So when I watch a fight this weekend, I'm going to be watching my boy, I call him my boy, Lomachenko. He's fighting in England. Do I have to worry that anything's going on? Like you have Povetkin, fighting one of the Hugh Theory. Do I have to worry that I'm watching something that may not be real?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it'll probably be a legitimate fight. I have testimony from Sammy Gravano to a Senate committee in the last chapter of my book, and he talks about there's so much money involved in these championship bouts, tens of millions of dollars, which weren't available to the fighters in an earlier time, and so they don't have to fix a fight to clean up. All they have to do is own the fighter, and they're going to make $10 million, whether the fighter wins or loses. And then there's often a rematch, so once again there are tens of millions of dollars at stake. So by owning something like that, they really don't have to fix it because the money involved is staggering.
You're right. I'm going to close our discussion with a quote from your book. The committee that was interviewing Gravano, they asked them, what can the government do to keep the mob out of boxing? And Gravano's answer was, make the purses smaller.
He was absolutely right.
And that's one of the best lines I've heard in a long time. Great book, Jeffrey, and I recommend it, whether you're a boxing fan or not. It has history in it, because boxing is a part of culture, and we want to get you back on our show. So what's your next project, quickly, please?
I'm writing a history of organized crime.
Oh, wow. Is it going to cover the whole history, or?
Primarily New York.
Right. And when will that be ready?
That'll probably come out in the summer of, let me see, probably the summer of 2020.
Okay. Well, keep us informed.
I will.
And you're right. Yeah, drop us a line, and we'll book you for the show. But thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I appreciated it.
Great. And have a great evening.
Same to you.
Right. Well, that was really interesting. A fascinating discussion about one of my favorite subjects. And you can catch it again on the artistfirst.com website. A reminder for all listeners out there, our next program is scheduled for September 5th, 2019. We have a panel discussion, Lou Diaz, Chuck Lutz, and Lou Rice. The topic, Ike Atkinson, Frank Lucas, and Nicky Barnes, the legacy, the DA perspective. We hope you enjoyed Crime Beat this evening on the Artist First World Radio Network. Wherever you are tonight, we'd like to thank all of you out there for listening to our broadcast this evening. In the meantime, we welcome your emails and thoughts about our program. You can email us at crimebeat123@yahoo.com, and please spread the word about our show. And until next week, we hope you tune in to Crime Beat next Thursday, same time at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where you'll have a front row seat to the fascinating world of crime. Sleep tight, everybody.